Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie were visiting Sarajevo. On June 28th, a Serbian nationalist, Gavrilo Princip, assassinated the Archduke and his wife. The assassination had widespread implications across Europe. Austria, Hungary and several other nations blamed the Serbian state for the killings. But as Russia was a supporter of Serbia, the Austro-Hungarian leadership didn't declare war immediately. They first sought the support of Kaiser Wilhelm II, the leader of the German Empire. Following his pledge of support, an ultimatum was sent to Serbia. Within 1 week, Russia, Belgium, France, Great Britain and Serbia had formed an alliance against Austria, Hungary and Germany. World War I had begun. The Germans began fighting on two fronts. In the west they invaded France through Belgium, and in the east they engaged the Russian army. The first battle on the western front was a heavy attack on the Belgian city of Liège, which fell by the 15th of August. 1 month later came the first Battle of the Marne, where French and British forces halted the German advances. This embarrassing defeat prevented the quick victory Germany had hoped for. Following the battle, both sides dug into the trenches as the Western Front prepared itself for a war of attrition that would last more than 3 years. The quality of life in the trenches varied by what side you fought for. The Germans had a head start and reinforced with iron and concrete, while the Allies had to contend with the mud. The way troops were allocated also had an impact, with German soldiers being allocated a zone for an undetermined length of time, allowing them to bed in. Allied troops, however, worked on 7-day shifts, which led to long-term issues with the trenches themselves. Life in the trenches was challenging to say the least. The cold weather, rain and mud meant that disease was a serious threat to survival, with dysentery, typhus and cholera being some of the additional dangers soldiers had to contend with. The mud was also an issue, with large craters being created by enemy shelling, resulting in some soldiers drowning inside them. One thing all soldiers feared were the gas attacks, with the first one coming in April 1915. Chlorine gas, mustard gas and other variations instilled fear in the frontline troops where morale was already struggling. One respite soldiers at the front had were writing and receiving letters. War correspondence was free of charge, with over 10 billion letters being sent to and from the front during the war. For soldiers in such bleak conditions, it was a chance to escape into the memories of their home, their families, or the possibility that one day this war would be over. The area between the opposing trenches was referred to as no man's land. This no man's land was watched day and night, with anyone foolish enough to venture out being shot. At night, both sides would sneak up to that zone and add barbed wire, traps and further fortifications to ensure the safety of their position. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, Russian forces invaded regions of East Prussia and Poland, but were too halted at the Battle of Tannenberg in late August 1914. Between 1914 and 1916, Russia conducted several offences on the Eastern Front, but were unable to break the German lines. The lack of progress, accompanied by economic instability in Russia, led to discontent in the Russian populace. This instability erupted in 1917 with the Russian Revolution, led by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks. This ended the Tsarist rule and halted Russian involvement in the war, leading the German prisoners to be freed to fight on the front lines once more. This also had another impact. It led America to enter World War I. As the war broke out in 1914, the United States were reluctant to enter the fray and remain neutral. President Woodrow Wilson continued to have commercial and shipping relationships with both sides. In 1915, Germany declared the waters surrounding the British Isles to be a war zone. German U-boats attacked and sunk several ships carrying cargo and passengers. These included US ships. These events led to Congress passing a $250 million arms bill readying the US for war. Following more US vessels being sunk, Woodrow Wilson appeared before Congress on April 2nd and called for a declaration of war against Germany. The US military had few all-black regiments, and the leadership were not keen on black soldiers serving alongside white soldiers. Instead, African American troops served in segregated labour battalions, taking on menial roles in the Army and Navy. Following criticism from the black community and civil rights groups, the first black combat units were formed in 1917. The 93rd Division, nicknamed the Harlem Hell Fighters, was sent to fight alongside the French forces. The 93rd fought gallantly for 191 days on the front lines, leading to the French awarding them for their heroic performance. More than 350,000 African American soldiers would go on to serve in World War I. The war required all able-bodied men to enlist and fight. This left a huge void in the manufacturing industries back home. Women, children and the elderly were employed in a variety of jobs in factories to ensure production would continue. This sparked a change in society that lived on long beyond the war itself. Women took on roles of responsibility and stayed in the jobs beyond the war, as huge numbers of men were killed on the battlefield. The Women's Institute flourished during this challenging period, and in the wake of the war, women's role in society had taken small steps towards equality, with women over the age of 30 being given the vote. Women were also involved in the war in non-combat roles, such as medical roles like nursing. The numbers of wounded in the war were far greater than anyone had predicted. Nurses were regarded as angels of the Great War, often acting as volunteers recruited by the Red Cross. They were carers, mothers and confidants, and helped a great many injured parties get back on their feet. The mainland conflict in Europe had reached a stalemate. The Allies diverted their attention to the Ottoman Empire, launching an attack on Gallipoli in April 1915. The invasion was a disaster, resulting in 250,000 casualties, and in January 1916 the Allied forces staged a full retreat. Due to the Russian exit from the war, Germany was able to grow in strength on the Western Front. On July 15, 1918, Germany launched a large attack on French forces, which were now bolstered by 85,000 US troops and some British troops. The Allies repelled the attack and launched a counter-offensive 3 days later. The Second Battle of the Marne was a decisive moment in the war. The heavy German casualties allowed the French to regain territory and push the German forces back over the following months. By late 1918, the end of the war was in sight. Austria and Hungary reached an armistice on November 4th. The Germans, who had become isolated, finally agreed to armistice on November 11th, 1918, which brought an end to World War I. In 1919, at the Paris Peace Conference, Allied leaders stated they wished to build a post-war world that would prevent such devastating future conflicts. The Versailles Treaty was signed on June 28, 1919. However, the discontent felt by Germany was left to boil under the surface. Germany was denied entrance into the League of Nations and began to resent the treaty, as Germany felt they had been tricked into signing it. Years passed, the resentment of the Versailles Treaty grew in Germany, and 2 decades later, this resentment was counted among the causes of World War II. The war brought with it a great amount of social change. Women's role in society grew as vast numbers joined the workforce, and some were subsequently given the freedom to vote. African American troops were given the right to fight in their own combat units. But sadly, the war also led to the widespread Spanish flu epidemic of 1918, which killed an estimated 20 to 50 million people. The use of chemical weapons during the war had shocked the world. It united people against their future use and led to the Geneva Convention, signed in 1925, which restricted the use of chemical and biological agents in warfare. The convention remains in effect to this day.